Well, welcome everybody, as usual, to the Marx's Volume 2 of Capital lecture series given by Andy Higginbottom. My name's Oliver Dodd. I'm on the steering committee of the Centre for Social and Global Justice, and we're very happy to continue hosting these series of Marx lecture series. Today, Andy will be giving his sixth lecture on Volume 2 of Das Kapital. The title and focus of the talk will be the simple reproduction of total capital. And he'll be talking, as usual, for about 45, 50 minutes, and we'll be following that up with a similar amount of time for the Q&A. The full talk will be recorded as usual and going on YouTube for other people to learn and engage with. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I really continue to appreciate your support and organisation of these series. So, as Oliver's already said, we're now on lecture 6 of the series, and that takes us into part 3. There are actually about 4 lectures on part 3. It's probably the best known part of volume 2, and it certainly did generate quite a lot of debate in the generations immediately after Marx, actually. So we'll come on to that towards the later later lectures. So I'll give a quick review of chapters 16 and 17. And I'm going to cover the introduction chapter for part 3, which is chapter 18. I'm going to be fairly brief on chapter 19. And in fact, I don't recommend that we read it at any great length, but you can decide as you prefer. So then I'm going to do a slight pause because that's all, if you like, the preliminaries. But then I want to present the main sort of course, which is simple reproduction. And the simple reproduction is of the total social capital in the form of commodities. It's all about the movement of commodities around a capitalist system as they're linked in circulation, how different parts of the production system are linked through markets with each other. And of course, I'll try to explain that a bit more. Marx is, as usual, extremely detailed and gets down to a lot of nitty-gritty in his explanation. I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty. I'm going to try and get over the main concepts at least. And I'm also slightly altering the order of his presentation, which I've never done before. But I just think I want to start off with what I think is a simpler case and move on to a more difficult case. There are 3 sort of broad cases that he looks at. Okay, and I'll explain that as we go through. Hence, I've slightly changed the order of presentation. Okay, chapter 16, from my interpretation, is a crucial chapter in the whole book. It is, for me, the pivot of the book in the sense that it raises issues that feed very directly into volume 3. And so in that chapter, Marx developed the idea of an annual surplus value, which is the surplus value which the capitalist gets over a whole year over the capital advance. That's the rate of profit then becomes the annual surplus value over the capital advance. Now, he looks at this in volume 3, and this is just a pointer forward to volume 3 at the level of the individual capital. He basically says that the rate of profit for an individual capital depends on the composition, the organic composition of capital, the rate of surplus value, and the turnover period. Those are the 3 main variables that he looks at. It's quite important to understand, in fact, that he's talking about the aggregate turnover. The other qualification, I should say, that he here was Engels, actually, because Engels wrote this chapter because he saw it as a gap, and he was quite right in the papers, if you like, the notes that Marx had left for volume 3. I think, actually, to be honest, Engels' motive, like so much of his work, was very well intended and basically right. But I do think there are some minor issues in the execution of his argument. And that is, we'll come on to it a bit later on as well, but the increase in the annual rate of surplus value is not because the annual surplus value produced increases, but the capital advance to get it reduces. Now, what's often not noted, and I do add this, right, is that the significance of this part of volume 2 is even greater for volume 3, and it feeds very importantly into the transformation problem. Now, in Marx's discussion of the transformation of simple values into prices of production, he makes a distinction between the capital advance, which we're now quite familiar with because we've been reading it time and time again in volume 2, which is, if you like, the overall capital invested at the beginning of the production process, and the capital used up, which is the amount of capital which is transferred into the commodities that are produced. And these are not the same thing. I mean, they're quite different things. You can imagine different amounts of production or different sort of setups of machinery, raw materials, and so on. So capital used up are costs transferred into the commodity product. And why this is important is in most of the interpretations of Marx's work on price of production conflate the two, and they assume away the difference. And I actually think the difference is very important conceptually. It's more than just a sort of numerical simplification. It actually changes the nature of the problem. And the prices of production are based on the general rate of profit and the capital advanced, not the capital used up, which is what many interpretations assume it to be, right? And in fact, there is a relation between the capital advance and the capital used up, which falls out very interestingly from the discussion in volume 2. And I only realized it in this series of lectures and readings, right? So if you think of the capital used up, there's a markup. So the cost price plus a certain markup will give you a rate of profit. So that's a different sort of ratio, if you like. And it does give a different sense of the problem because it's like cost plus. So you can sort of build a concept of prices of production around simply what it costs the capitalist to produce the commodities. So this different sense is lost, I'm saying, in the interpretive literature. But there is something really interesting which falls out from this discussion, which is the ratio between the markup and the rate of profit is the same as the ratio between the capital advanced and the capital used up. And even more interesting, that ratio is the turnover time of the aggregate capital. So I think this is something which has just sort of come out of looking at this again. And I mean, I'm anticipating heavily, but I want you to give you a sense of an idea of why all this sort of winter training in volume 2 can prove to be important in the later discussions. And this is a crucial paragraph in the reading group. We sort of labored over this a bit. What Marx is saying basically is that there's a relationship between the turnover time and the surplus value produced and the amount of capital that needs to be advanced to get that surplus value for the capitalist. And you can look at this relation in one of two ways. I mean, because it's a relation, you can look at it from either end. So Marx's main examples are looked at from the end of, for a given scale of production, if you increase the turnover time, then less capital advance is needed. And this is his main example. But it is also true the other way around, which is for a given capital advanced, the scale of production can be increased if the turnover time is shorter. So in other words, you can be more efficient as a capitalist, if you like, in putting that capital to work. And that is just the same relation, but if you like, put the other way around. And in which case there will be more surplus value. The scale of production will be expanded. Turnover time, therefore, allows for an expansion in the scale of production. I think the first of these two, from Marx's examples in this whole discussion, that is for a given scale of production, turnover time affects surplus affects turnover time affects the capital advance, right? Corresponds more to different industries. Typical capitals in engineering of trains or locomotives or cotton spinning would be very different in terms of the amount of capital needed to put a given number of workers in motion. And that in itself raises a big question, which is the problem of profitability, which is why Marx answers it in volume 3. Okay, the key point here, and this is something really important concept, right, is to carry forward the concept of the relation between the surplus value produced to the amount of capital advance, this is variable capital, that is required to achieve it. And the faster the turnover is, then that increases the ratio of surplus value to capital advance. Okay, that is a repetition, but a summary based on some of the issues that came up in the reading group. Just wanted to clarify. I found chapter 17, as I've already said, very sort of stimulating and not quite so finished as an argument, I have to say. It's really surprising how topical Marx's questioning here is. The problem he's stating is, where does the money come from? He's moving this to a systemic level. He's not asking this at the level of individual capitals, but where does the money come from for the capitalist system? And what he means by this is pretty clear if you on reading it. He actually means the money. And he makes an assumption this is metallic money. So where does the money come from, which is used to circulate commodities? Now, there is a different interpretation, and there are some indications of a basis for it, which is Harvey's interpretation, which is when Marx asks, where does the money come from? He's actually asking, where does the effective demand for commodities come from? In other words, it's more in line with a sort of normal orthodox Keynesian type question. I think it's pretty clear in the text. Marx isn't asking that question in particular. He's asking, no, where does the money as money come from, which is then in the hands of consumers, workers, or capitalists, and so on. Right? And he's in particular saying, well, if production is expanding year on year, where does the extra money come from year on year? Okay, so that's a discussion point. My observations about this, right, are that you can't understand Marx's argument at any point really without also thinking about money as well as commodities and the movement of money as well as the circulation is an exchange. If commodities move one way, then money moves the other way. And this is something which carries forward into part 3. It's a point of continuity in his analysis. Also, when he moves into the social totality from an individual capital, Marx chooses to do that from the perspective of commodity capital, from the movement of commodities around the system as a whole. That's what he's looking at in volume 2, part 3. Now, chapter 18 is kind of like, I'm not going to read all this out because I've almost said it in a way. I think chapter 18 is a very good summary and should be read very fully. I think it's an excellent chapter where he states the object of the inquiry overall. He's very clear what he's done in volume 1 and what he's done in volume 2 so far. And now he's moving on to looking at these circuits of individual capitals considered in their totality. And he's basically saying that there are two components. One is the movement of capital and the other is the movement of commodities. And both are sort of integrated, both are involved in the system as a whole. And when he's talking about commodity circulation in general, he does think about capital circulation, but he's also thinking about commodities which go into individual consumption. So if you think of this is the whole thing between money, commodities, and more money on the one hand, which is one type of circulation, and on the other hand, commodities, money, and a different commodity on the other. And the movement from commodity to money to commodity is definitely involved when wages are paid to the workers. They get a wage, they use their wage to buy commodities, and they get a wage because they've sold a commodity, which is their labor power. So that's an example of a CMC type sequence. He also says, and this you might find this a bit more surprising, that this is also the case when capitalists spend the revenue which they get from surplus value. It's also an example of a simple circulation. The capitalists have drawn money for their own consumption out of the profits of the enterprise, and they'll use that to buy commodities. In that case, not to expand their capital, but just to enjoy in luxury consumption. Okay. So these two forms are interlinked completely necessarily in the overall system. Okay. And another thing that chapter 18 does is it talks about how we started off with money capital as like the prime mover. And we went round, and I'm just explaining his summary in my diagrammatic terms. We start off with commodity capital, sorry, with money capital, which buys things the commodities need to produce in production. Production produces commodities which have a greater value than the commodities that were started with, and that greater value comes from the surplus labor of the workers in production. And that's the cycle. That's the cycle. Money capital starts, moves it around, and comes back to money capital, on the basis that there has to be more money capital at the end than at the beginning. And this chapter also summarizes well the question which we looked at in part 2, which is the question of turnover. And this, I've already sort of summarized this, so I'm not going to labor that, but it's a very good summary. And I'm just showing it again diagrammatically, which is if you have a case where there's 10 turnovers a year, then the commodities are sold, and that, in other words, every 5 weeks, then the money's coming back to the capitalists much more quickly than if they're building a sort of a bigger machine and they can only finish the job after a year, and they can only sell it after it's completed a year in. And therefore, even with the same number of workers and the same degree of exploitation of those workers, they're going to need more money advanced in order to keep production continuous throughout the whole year. And that's the question of money capital and the effect of turnover on it. Okay, in chapter 19 now, moving on to the new material, Marx starts this off by an interrogation of Adam Smith again. And it's very similar to what we've seen already with chapter 11, where he critiqued Smith on the grounds of missing the distinction between fixed and circulating capital on the one hand and constant and variable capital on the other. And it does follow a similar pattern. And he basically accepts that Smith inherited quite a lot of basic political economy from the physiocrats and generalized them to away from agriculture across manufacturing. Basically, Marx's discussion of Smith allows Marx to draw out two distinctions, right? The first distinction is between the total annual product and the new value, which is incorporated in that product within the year. So, and I'll explain this a bit more because it's a very important point. The second distinction, which Marx draws out, is that between sections of the economy or branches of the economy which are producing the means of production, and those branches which produce articles of consumption. And so Smith works with this distinction. So, but what Smith confused in Marx's critical assessment of him is Smith confused the difference between the total annual product and the new value incorporated in that annual product. And the reason he confused those two is because he didn't have a clear concept of the constant capital, which is transferred into the commodities. So the total annual product value will include the constant capital transferred, which is made in previous years and transferred into the new product, the steel which goes into the cars, or the seeds which are used and when you're growing a new crop. These are inputs within the annual production cycle, and in addition to those inputs, there is new value added, but the new value isn't the entire annual product. It's got to include this transfer of constant capital. So Marx draws that point out. If you're watching this as a recording, you might want to pause there, but otherwise we're going to keep on going. Now then, the main chapter, simple reproduction. This is the concept overall is similar to what Marx has already deployed in volume 1, when he looked at the totality as the reproduction of a class relation. What he's doing here is going to be different, but there's a sort of similar pattern in the structure of his argument, right? He's moving from the way things work at the level of an individual capital to the way the totality of the system as a whole works. what is it that he's looking at here? He's saying that the annual product includes parts of the social product that replace capital. So in other words, in 1 year, capital system has to produce stuff which it then reuses in the following year to continue the cycle of production. At the same time, it also includes commodities that are going to be consumed during that year, such as the workers' subsistence and the capitalist luxury consumption. Okay, so what you have then is two different broad subcategories, or even three if you separate the workers and the capitalist consumption, three subcategories of the use to which the annual product is going to be put. So the annual product presents itself in the form of commodity capital, and he continues his use of this idea of C prime, which is the commodity capital, which includes now the surplus value which it bears. So the preconditions for social reproduction can be immediately recognized from the fact that it is necessary to demonstrate what becomes of each portion of the value of this overall product C prime, commodity capital. And this is a really important methodological point, and some interpretations will go more on one side than another, but I think it's pretty clear that Marx considers both, which is that the replacement, the reproduction of these components of C prime has to be considered both in value, and there he means exchange value terms, amounts of money, and in material terms, that's exchange values and use values. So the circulation of the total social capital, he's looking at it in the commodity form. And because it's a capitalist system, that's primarily as commodity capital. Okay, and he asks two questions just to focus. These are the two questions that he's going to address, right? How is the capital consumed in production replaced in its value out of the annual product? Okay, that's question one. Right. Question two, how is the movement of this replacement intertwined with the consumption of surplus value by the capitalists and of wages by the workers? Right. Now, as I've said, this is similar to volume one, but actually it's quite technical. We'll come on to that in a little while. And he first looks at this as reproduction on a simple scale. He's not going to be looking at any deviations of commodity exchange value from their simple values for the time being. As long as we're dealing with capital's value, production, and the value of its product individually, the natural form of the commodity product was a matter of complete indifference. This purely formal manner of presentation is no longer sufficient once we consider the total social capital and the value of its product. So what he's saying is that use value matters. It matters at this level of analysis what things are being used for that have been produced. The supposition is that a social capital of a given value supplies the same mass of commodity values and satisfies the same quantity of needs in both the current year and the previous year. That's the simple reproduction argument. And what that means is that all of the surplus value which has been produced in a year, and that is the same as all the surplus commodity product that's been produced in a year, is consumed. And the only class that can consume the surplus value is the capitalist class. So he's only got a two-class situation here, workers and capitalists. Okay. So the fact that all the social surplus value is consumed is the condition of simple reproduction. I mean, there's no surplus value being reinvested in expanding the scale of production. Okay, so we've got two departments of social production, one which produces the means of production, machines, locomotives, good example, and one which produces the means of consumption. Again, cotton yarn would be a good example of that. Now, it's important to get the level of abstraction here. He's not talking about individual branches. He's not talking about locomotive production alone, right? He's talking about all the things that produce machinery and raw materials, by the way. Okay, they're producing means of production, and all the industries that produce means of consumption, like food would be a classic example, clothing, and so on, right? So this is a quite a high level of abstraction. It's not a multiple of 25 different industrial sectors. It's by definition limited to only two broad categories: means of production, means of consumption. Now, within each of those broad departmental categories, the annual product breaks down, as we know very well, into the value of the commodities, at least, is composed of the constant value transferred, the equivalent of the variable capital, and the surplus value. So we've got those two components in terms of what capital has been advanced into production, the variable capital and constant capital. Okay. And this is the capital which is consumed in the production process. And he says here, this is not the same thing as the value of the constant capital applied in production. Well, actually, I think that's a mistake in the text. And I don't know if it's in the original note or in the translation or what. But I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. In actual fact, those two things are the same. The capital applied is the capital consumed. So that should read on that page, the capital advance. So the key distinction is between the capital advance and the capital consumed. Right. Part of the fixed capital continues to function, is assuming away fixed capital for the time being, and he's also abstracting away from wear and tear. So even though this is going to, as you'll see in a minute, quite complex, there's quite a lot of simplifying assumptions in his first look at this. Okay, so let's have a diagram. We're talking money, and it has to be a national money, and so all those figures you see there are money. Okay, so you've got a capital invested in production of £4,000 constant, £1,000 variable, and that's £5,000. And with that investment, all the capitalists producing means of production, so it's an aggregate of all of them, they produce a value of £1,000 more, which is the surplus value, i.e. £6,000. And that in department one, that exists in the form, the physical form of means of production. This is raw materials, which he doesn't really speak of, but have to be there. This is the locomotive, etc. Right? And in the department two, production scale investments are lower, notably, but similar sort of proportions between capital and constant capital and variable capital. And the scale of production employs fewer workers, but they produce C plus V plus S equals £3,000 a year. Okay, and that exists in terms of means of consumption. So you just add those up and you get the totals there. What Marx is going to do is going to take us through three necessary transactions between what workers consume. The workers in this department two, will consume some of the stuff they're produced. May not be exactly the same stuff they're produced. I mean, the workers producing frozen peas may want to eat, I don't know, potatoes now and again, or the workers producing jeans may want to wear t-shirts now and again, so they'll have to buy them, right? But they're within the same department. They're just taking them off different capitalists within the same department. And then you have exchanges between departments, which Marx gives a very high priority to, which is the workers in department one who are producing locomotives. They also like peas or want to eat peas and, you know, wear a t-shirt and so on. So they have to, with their wage, buy means of consumption, and it'll be the capitalists in department two who will be selling it to them, right? So that's an example of an exchange between departments. And then you have the exchange going the other way, which is the producers of the peas or the t-shirts need means of production, right? So they're going to have to buy their t-shirt machine or their frozen pea packaging production line from the producers of the means of production. So that's an exchange going in the opposite direction. And then finally, the third type of exchange marks under these broad categories is that the producers who produce machines to make peas will also have to buy stuff like steel or other things to help them make those machines. So there's a circulation within the production for means of production. Okay, I'm going to take these in a minute, one at a time, but I just want to sort of spell this out. This is Department 1. These are the inputs to the production. These are the outputs from annual production. This is Department 2, smaller scale, and this is the additional stuff. Now, even before we go very far into the detail, there's some really important broad strokes points here, right? So we've identified what simple reproduction is. It's the same scale of production from one year to the next. That's fairly straightforward. However, what this means is in terms of where do commodities end up? The commodities that have been produced in the means of production department, these ones here, they're going to end up here next year, right? Because they're cycling back to reproduce, on the same basis, if you like, what they did this year. So that's one type of movement, okay? Now, what about these ones? These ones are also means of production, and they're going to end up here, right? Because they're the pea making machines or the t-shirt making machines or even the peas as well, right? Okay, so not the peas, no, that would be right. The pea making machine, okay? So that's that movement. So we can see now we've already accounted for all the commodities which we could call means of production. They've been recycled back into the two departments. But we haven't explained all of this yet either, right? So we've got something else to look at, right? What about the new value that's created that is for consumption? Well, there are two issues here, and this is where it gets quite subtle. I want you to follow this closely, right? The total new value added is across the two departments. Okay, so you can see the new value added in a year is 2,000. This is the point of distinction between the total annual product and the value added in a year. Okay, the value added this year in this department is 2,000, right? The value added in this department is 1,000. So that's the total new value added is 3,000. Okay, so that's the value of the, but some of that is constant capital means production in here. So where does this one go, right? So all of this is means of consumption. So these means of consumption are going to be consumed, as the words indicate, and they'll be consumed by workers and by capitalists. So some of these will be consumed by the workers in Department 1, and some will be consumed by workers in Department 2, and some will be consumed by the capitalists in these two departments. Okay, so what we have then is a situation where this amount, the means of consumption, must, for this system to work at all, as a matter of logic, if you like, in terms of a simple reproduction, this amount must equal these two amounts, right? And that's something that Marx, I think, was the first to draw out, as far as I know, right? The total new value must equal the value of the commodities produced for consumption. That's a really important, I mean, it'll take you a while for that to sink in, I suspect, right? But it's a really important sort of initial finding, right? Now, what we've got is also something not shown on this diagram, which is those commodities produced in Department 2, which don't go into the consumption of the workers, but go into the consumption of the capitalists, right? They are outside of the production. They just get consumed. They don't re-enter the production cycle. At least the commodities which workers consume do re-enter in a different form of their labor power. Okay. So this is a very important initial result, as I'm sort of emphasizing, and I want to highlight that now. You can see that it's by design. Marx has set up these numbers by design. He's saying that the 3,000 of the new value is the same, the 3,000 new value, sorry, here, is the same as the 3,000 of the means of consumption that are produced in that year, this one here. Okay. Yeah, that needs to sink in. Okay, so we're going to do this again in next level of detail down. Okay, so now we are going to have the two departments. We're going to have workers and capitalists in both departments. And I'll start with workers buying peas or t-shirts. Okay, so they're going to buy means of consumption. They get paid a salary by the capitalists who are exploiting them. They get paid a wage. With that wage, they buy the stuff that's been produced in that department. And with that wage, they give money back. They pay money back to whoever's selling them the peas or the t-shirts, right? Now, Marx draws out a further distinction then between the capitalists in this department, which are producing stuff which workers consume, and the capitalists are producing stuff that only capitalists consume. So at the moment, we're calling this stuff that workers consume as 2A subdivision. And of course, the end of the story, or the end of this little cycle, is that having consumed the workers' commodities, they eat the peas and they replenish their labor power. And the missing element is, well, between peas and labor power, people do work as well. And those people are normally women. They cook the peas and they wash the dishes and so on. Okay, that's an unspoken reality. So that's the first type of, that's the first category of movement. Okay, now let's look at the second category. This is the capitalists in this department consume their yachts and their racehorses and so on, which workers don't have access to. And this is, and all the capitalists in this department do that. So the capitalists who are producing peas will actually get those commodities from the capitalists who produce yachts. So that, again, there's a sort of an internal subdivision there. Okay, so that completes Marx's idea of the movements of money and commodities involved within Department 2. That's the first step of 3. Okay. And once again, actually, in actual fact, Marx does give more attention to this. Within the capitalist consumption, there will be servants, there'll be maids and butlers and jockeys and what have you, who are actually just their wage is basically revenue spent by the capitalists, not to make more money, but just to enjoy their pastime or their meal or what have you. Okay, now, how about within, well, this is Marx's explanation, which largely because of time, I think I'm not going to, you can read this, but this is exactly what I've said, but from his text. Okay, there is something that I do draw attention to from his text, which is in this part, in this section, Marx makes a big issue about what this means in terms of crisis, right? He says that every crisis decreases luxury consumption. He says that means workers are discharged, and those butlers are also discharged as well. The workers producing yachts lose their jobs, and the workers serving wine and champagne on those yachts, they lose their jobs too. But then this is an important point on page 487. He says that crises are provoked by a lack of effective demand or effective consumption. To say that is a tautology, but of course, in a crisis there will be less demand, right? But it doesn't explain it. It's a phenomenon of the crisis rather than an explanation of the crisis. Hence, he uses the word tautology. Clearly, in a crisis, workers are going to have less money. There's more unemployment. But is that the cause of the crisis? Is another question, right? Okay, that's an important point we'll come back to in the final commentary. Okay, what I want to do now is to build on the first type of exchange that Marx has told us about, to look at the second type of exchanges. And this is within the first department, production of the means of production. And here you can see, obviously, that the means of production are produced in 1 year. Capitalists will buy them and they'll put them to use in the next year. So that's what we have here. Okay. This one's fairly straightforward. Again, there'll be different individual sort of branches of production within the department. You know, so locomotive makers will be buying steel, and steel makers will be buying locomotives, I guess. Okay, but that's the aggregate pattern. This one again, Marx explained in a lot more detail. There's a general point he makes already from the discussion so far, which is it's important to understand that it's capital which initiates these exchanges, right? Capital is a sort of the active agent in initiating these exchanges. I mean, even the workers, they have to be paid, and they get paid by capital. I mean, that is domination, basically. It's the presiding power, if you like, right? He doesn't yet look at fixed and circulating, by the way, so we haven't gone into that level of complexity. And once again, these are Marx's comments on what I've just showed you, which is the internal exchanges within Department 1. And he does say that even without a capitalist system, any system of social production would have to have a way of doing this, right? You have to be able to reproduce and store up the means of production for the next round of production, and bring them into work, into use. Okay. So here he's dealing with inputs and outputs. But so far within departments, I'm going to look at in a minute between departments, and I'm just emphasizing this is a very different level of abstraction than the different branches of production or spheres of production, as he sometimes says, or industrial sectors, as we'd normally say today, right? And again, the confusion of those two is actually characteristic of a common misreading of Volume 3. And what Marx is looking at here are inputs and outputs between departments of production as a very broad category. And in a socialist society, you would also need inputs and outputs between different branches of production, but on basis of a plan. So now in the third type of exchange, Marx's notation becomes more important, and people do get lost in this notation. So if I labor the point, you'll have to forgive me, but those I don't want you to get lost. So far, so good. This is what we've got so far, I hope. Right. Next type of transaction. And this is going to involve 3 different types of exchange between the 2 departments. Okay. The first type of exchange. So the capitalists pay their workers a wage. The workers use that wage. They're building locomotives, but they want to buy peas. Okay. So they use their wage to buy peas. Right. That's the example I'm using. Got stuck on locomotives and peas. All right. That's one type of exchange. And notice the money moves between departments. Right. The commodities move between departments one way. The money moves between departments another way. Now then, the workers will use the peas to rebuild their strength and go to work the next day. So they become exchanged once more for variable capital. That's their labor power going in. Next cycle. The capitalists in Department 2 buy means of production from the capitalists in Department 1. There we are, the money's going, and the machines that make peas are going in the opposite direction. Okay, so that's another type of exchange between departments. And then we've got one third type of exchange, which we haven't looked at yet, which is the capitalists in Department 1 buy their luxury items from the capitalists in Department 2. So the money comes from one department to the other, and the commodities again go in the opposite direction. And so what you end up with is an equivalence between 2 categories. One is the means of production, which is the new value in means of production produced in the year in Department 1, must be the same value, not use value, but the same exchange value as the constant capital needed to be invested in Department 2 for the next year. That's a result. There's a second big result from Marx. And again, I mean, this is, how, what's the word, methodical and detailed Marx is. This is quite hard to grasp. It's not immediately intuitive, but the more you think about it, the more obvious that must be the case. For simple reproduction, what it means is this part, the first part of the means of production, are going to go back into producing means of production. So where is the other stuff going to go? Well, that's just at the same scale. So all new value must be going into the means of production, produced means of consumption. And you can follow similar sort of arguments as you go through. Again, this is Marx's detailed explanation. It's very important to recognize that this is not barter. When you look at it at the aggregate level, you could understand this as barter. And many of the interpretations kind of like downplay the reverse movement of money. It's not. These are all monetary exchanges. So money has to be there all the time as the means of circulation. The values exist as exchange values and they're converted into money, right? So the money moves. The money is the lubricant of the whole thing. Now, there's a series of individual transactions, but the ultimate condition that Marx is explaining is that they have to have an equivalent value exchange between the two departments. And this is his main sort of conclusion. And in his notation, the new value, or I just tried to highlight this, I should have highlighted it. The new value produced in Department 1 must equal the constant capital applied in Department 2 for simple reproduction. They must be equal. And then he goes on to explain in more detail than I will. And this is kind of like an example. It's a series of transactions that Marx posits about how you could end up with this, right? And you're going to have, even this is an aggregate level. It's just not quite so aggregate as the other aggregate level. It's a sort of medium level. All is going to be actually on a series of individual transactions, right? A lot of workers have got to buy a lot of peas, okay? But the point is that the trigger for this starts with from capital, whether it's paying wages or whether it's spending money on its own luxury consumption. Okay, so the capitalists are sort of, as I've sort of laboured, I think a little bit, are the sort of initiators in this whole movement of money. Okay, now Marx explains this on this page here. I mean, it's very much not the workers who are initiators. It is the individual capitalists by spending on their own consumption or by advancing money. Well, we've seen this a lot in part 2. They advance money to get capitalist production moving. So whether it's consumption or production, Marx presents this as being very much the initial mover is the capitalist class rather than the working class. There's a dependency, if you like, of the working class, a capacity to spend money on the capitalist class paying them wages. The real course of events, he says, is further obscured, and one is the fact that commercial capital is also present, and that is pure money capital, right? And that's different to how the industrial capital works in circulation. He doesn't go into that in any detail. In both these points, he goes into a lot more detail again in volume 3. And the big point here is that in reality, surplus value does not only go to the industrial capitalists, it also goes to landowners, to money lenders, and to the state as well. Okay, so it does get more complicated even than what we've seen already. But Marx lays the basis once again for obviously historically critique of Malthus about the landowning class. And I should just emphasize what's at the bottom here. What is always forgotten when you have these different forms of sharing out the money, right, from rent and interest and so on. And this is actually, in my view, part of Marx's genius, there's another way of putting it. He is able to trace all those phenomenal forms back to their real source, which is the surplus labor taken, exploited from the workers, right? So he doesn't quite say that here, but he gives us again a strong hint that he's got he knows why they can get this money is because of the exploitation of the workers. So what we've got here is a broader explanation or commentary on the system, which once again, I think militates against the underconsumptionist type of interpretation, which is in a capitalist system, it is capital and its decision to spend or invest, which is sort of like the primary motor. We haven't got the full picture yet, but we've got that much of a full picture. And so this does come on to how this is my last thing. I'm close to time anyway, which is good. This part 3 is probably has been in the literature the most discussed part of volume 2. okay, so what can we say about it? First of all, exchanges must include money. Secondly, what we've got here in part 3 is the relevance of part 1, and has become clear, which is that commodities are treated here as a form of capital. They're carrying capital values as they move around. So far, what Marx has produced in terms of turnover and capital advanced and fixed and circulating capital and so on, all the things he developed in part 2, they haven't really come into play much so far in chapter 20. Okay. But also in positioning, and just to return to a point I made right at the beginning, right? This is the second of 3 takes that Marx has on the totality of social capital as a general set of relations. The first one is in volume 1, where he sees the totality as a reproduction of class. The second one here is of commodity exchanges. And the third one will be of profitability. Okay. So you take each point, gives you a different perspective. What is this perspective? Is that the reproduction of a system is possible at all? I mean, in a way, Marx is arguing it is possible for capitalism to work. I mean, that's sort of an unlikely perspective from Marx, but it is actually, it's a genuine problem. I mean, given that this is not planned and you've got this whole series of market exchanges, how is it at all possible that it hangs together at all, right? Well, even without a directing will, Marx is drawing out the logic of how it could hang together, right? Which is how these equivalent exchanges have to take place for it to reproduce. Okay, so if you like, this is a logical precondition of aggregate production, and actually, this particular precondition is not only for capitalism, right? It will be for other modes of production as well, and is how it's possible to reproduce balancing between production and consumption sort of strands. Okay. Now, what is different to other interpretations is this is not a statement of general equilibrium, right? It's a statement of a necessary condition of being a system at all. It doesn't mean to say a system's in equilibrium. It just means that it functions as a system, right? And this is where I do come to the critique of Harvey again, right? Now, Harvey labors away at trying to explain Marx's comment, which I quoted earlier, right? About, it's capital spend that matters much more than workers spend, right? Because why? Because he argues, generally speaking, an underconsumptionist view, which is you can spend your way out of a crisis. Okay. Now, what does Harvey argue is in place of that? He tries to put the contradiction of the system in the reproduction schema. And what is the contradiction he puts there is the stress between the difference between use values and exchange values, amongst others, which he doesn't specify. Now, I argue that use value and exchange value are clearly necessary in this explanation. There's no question of that. But that's not the same as saying that they're the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist system, right? There is a difference between a distinction and an antagonistic contradiction. But I don't think they are posed as an antagonistic contradiction. Rather, they're sort of like interacting poles, but they're not in antagonistic contradiction. And I think that's important in terms of understanding what the systemic crisis of capitalism, which Marx has not yet given us an explanation of, right? But in a sense, he's telling us what it is not, rather than necessarily telling us what the determinate cause is, right? And that, again, we'll have to wait to volume 3 for that. Okay, I will stop share and I've finished my lecture. I hope that was okay.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. That was great. We're going to move it over to the Q&A now for another, how long we got? About 30 minutes for people to ask questions. You can feel free to ask questions in the chat or directly. Just put up your electronic hand if you would like to ask a question directly. That would be very much appreciated. Who would like to go first then? Virginia?
Hi, thanks. In the capitalist system, what would happen to money if capitalists didn't invest in luxury consumption? Where in sort of dealing with where the money comes from question.
Yeah. Well, that's more of a demand question than where does the money come from, if I can make that distinction. Yeah. I mean, when Marx is asking where does the money come from, he's actually saying where is the money that anybody is using to pay for stuff come from? You see what I'm getting at, right? Well, if the capitalists don't spend, then it keeps on expanding, and we can actually look at that. How Marx presents expansion of production. He doesn't look at it in an absolute way, but he'll say, okay, well, let's look at expansion in terms of the capitalists don't consume all of the surplus value in a year, right? But only some of it. And in broad terms, this relationship, which he's identified, still holds that of the simple reproduction, the things that the two sectors needing to be in step, right? Now, why would it be that capitalists stop spending on luxuries? Well, I mean, in the context that Marx is presenting it here, he says that will happen when a crisis is coming. So then you have to ask, well, why is a crisis coming? And that takes it back to the crisis of profitability. Yeah. And that's not a full answer to your question. It's kind of like I'm sticking close to how Marx, I believe, would sort of answer it, given how he's written the book, right? In other words, the determination comes in volume 3 with profitability. Okay, so if how capitalists act is the vector of their action is profitability arising out of production, but of course the consumption sort of follows on, I guess one would say. The other thing that he does bring in here is the action of capital relation as a class relation, yeah, which is, there's a clear distinction between what workers spend and can consume and what capitalists can. And yeah, he's talking about not only about capital, but about the capitalist class, and he's connecting the two.
Who would like to go next?
This is a very big area, by the way, Virginia, because you think of things like armaments expenditure, and this is quite a big debate on the British left, at least, right, about this categories 2A and 2B. So if you think of people like Keynes and so on, I mean, they would say, well, you can dig your way out of a crisis by getting people to dig holes and fill them up again, right? It's completely wasteful expenditure but it generates demand, okay? But if you think of it from the point of view of the capitalist state, Marx does include there, these other sort of layers of use of surplus value, the landowners, the banks, and the state. Well, if the state's building, lots of weapons, for example, right? I mean, how do they get consumed? They get consumed in wars, basically, or not. But I mean, certainly workers don't consume them in any normal sense of the term, right? So it's quite this luxury consumption idea can be expanded to be quite quite big categories of state expenditure. Yeah.
Just one sub point to that before you move on. How some of that would have to relate in a different way to what Marini is talking about in terms of workers, super exploited workers not being able to buy things while their capitalists are investing in or buying luxury goods. If I'm not confusing too many things there.
No, I think you're right. Again, you touch on a very big area point, don't you? I mean, what is normal consumption for a worker in Brazil and normal consumption for a worker in Germany or England? There is a whole discussion about the imperialist mode of living, where actually workers in one part of the world have been consuming things which are sort of relatively privileged compared to what workers in other parts of the world get to consume. Yeah. And so the boundary, I mean, Marx is quite careful about this, actually. If you read the text, it's quite clear. He's saying what he says is luxury consumption is that above and beyond is sort of quite a qualified statement, right? He knows that capitalists can eat peas and use butter to put on them, the same as workers do, right? It's those extra things which workers just can't afford and won't get.
Who would like to ask a question? Have we got anything in the chat? John, I can see your finger up.
Yeah, just a small point here. I mean, there's so much really interesting things in that lecture you just gave, and I was particularly taken with the really interesting interpretation of the capital advanced versus capital consumed, and how the ratio between the two equals. I mean, it's very, very interesting. I'm going to be lying awake thinking about that, perhaps. Well, anyway, just a small point I wanted to add, which kind of connects with Ginny's question, and I just think it helps if we just think about how we use the term production and consumption, because Marx in volume 2 here distinguishes between productive consumption and unproductive consumption. And at one point, for instance, he refers to when the workers spend their wages on consumption goods and consume them, which is all they do with their wages. That is unproductive consumption. Okay, but when the capitalist consumes labor power in the production process, that is productive consumption. And when the capitalist consumes the fluid capital in production, and the value of that of those commodities is transferred into the newly produced commodities, that is productive consumption. So, in other words, it's just on the other hand, you can say luxury consumption is unproductive consumption in the same way. In the same way that workers consuming consumption goods is also unproductive consumption. In other words, it's not leading to any new product. Although there is obviously a big difference about where the money comes from to finance the unproductive consumption of the capitalist and of the worker. But anyway, they're both forms of unproductive consumption. And from that point of view, arms production is also unproductive consumption. It does not lead to any new products. The provision of when governments borrow money to finance arms production, they are expanding demand, but they're not actually producing any commodities which are actually going to be, actually say they're not, they're not being, that is not expanding the total mass of commodities in circulation. Although then it starts getting complicated because there is an arms trade, and there is arms are then bought and sold. Anyway, I'm just trying to say the difference between productive consumption and unproductive consumption, and just to understand to help us really just think about the term production and consumption and exactly what we mean by them. I don't know whether that was helpful, but I hope it was.
I mean, yeah, but let's take some more.
Richard?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I haven't read ahead, so it's all a bit like fluffy for me at the moment. But just picking up on your comment that the exchange value was not necessarily antagonistic as or provoking of crisis necessarily. So I'm just wondering then, so could you have in a socialist system, could you have both use value and exchange value, where say exchange value was used as a way to manage, for example, genuine scarcity as opposed to artificial scarcity? Or is it already like impossible because it's tied up with surplus value, which is extractive and exploitative?
Yeah. Okay, maybe I just want to also respond to John's comment, so I'll just hold him back just to see. There is a distinction between the unproductive consumption of the worker and of the capitalist, which I mean, I think we would readily agree with, which is the worker's consumption leads to the production of their labor power, and that does re-enter the system. right? I mean, it has to, because that's the reproduction of the active element in the production, right? So, yeah, I mean, if you read that sentence on its own, I would accept the point. But I think if you know, within that, there has to be this distinction. I mean, even in the diagrams that I gave, right? I mean, there's an indirect return from the workers into whatever department they're working in. The value of their labor power, the exchange value of their labor power, basically, is exchanged for a wage. Whereas in Marx's schema, at least, once you've got the capitalist buying stuff for electric consumption, that's it. It might as well be burnt. You know what I mean? It's just gone. It might as well be jet fuel creating the explosion in the atmosphere or something, you know. So there's two other sort of related points. Okay, this hasn't been a question, but it is related, right? If you think of what the capitalist luxury consumption is, there are two different ways you can think about it, and I think one is more present in Marx's time, right? Which is, you know, you got the capitalist has a yacht. They have a luxury yacht. You can see some of these billionaire yachts in the south of France or wherever, right? And they do have working for them their butlers and their maids and their crew and so on and so forth, right? Okay. Then you have something else, which is like the modern cruise ship. Okay. And you do have people, upper middle class or whatever, I don't know how low down it goes, right? Who've got enough money to spend £2,000 to go on a cruise ship for a couple of weeks, right? So they are slightly different categories, right? I mean, you know, Marx is much more. I think Marx is really speaking about the first category, right? Which, when he talks about capitalist luxury consumption, it's revenue exchange. He writes here and there about maids and so on, right? It's revenue exchanged directly for services provided to them mostly. And then the third point was this thing about use value and exchange value, right? I think that very early on in Capital, Marx says, you know, any system you could think of, you're always going to have labor, right? And he sort of comes back to this in chapter 7, you know, the first part of chapter 7. What's common to all modes of production is a labor process. You're going to have instruments of production. You're going to have means of production. You're going to have active labor. So in a socialist system, there would have to be some type of accounting. And there would be, I think, some type of abstraction. I can't see any other way of doing it, because you're still going to have the differentiation between different types of products. So how do you make, you know, locomotives equal to peas? Well, it's pretty hard in terms of anything apart from some form of abstraction. Now, that could be labor units, how much time it takes, and it could be, or some form of money of account, right? So I do think in that sense, money of account would continue. It wouldn't be the same as exchange value of money in the capitalist system. And the reason is much less because of the contrast with how Marx explained the emergence of money, but with the contrast of how money really is in the capitalist system, right? Which we're edging our way towards, right? Money in the capitalist system is money capital, right? So it's not just money expresses the value of commodities, right? It's money capital. So the whole question of the rate of interest and so on, right? That's what money is in the capitalist system. It's capitalist money, okay? It's not simple money anymore. And so the rupture from capitalist money would be greater, but you could have a kind of like a, I don't know, an early socialist money in inverted commas. You know, you would need some kind of accounting system even to make the plan between, you know, how many peas we're going to produce this year to feed all the workers in who are making locomotives, right? I mean,
Anyone else?
killed it dead.
Tim?
It may be just my personal confusion, but I'm wrestling with some of the things that John said in the context of what Andy's just said about luxury production and distinguishing within it. But in my old school approach, I always believed that it was really important to distinguish between productive and unproductive forms in terms of they're productive or unproductive in terms of their contribution towards creation of profit, rather than the technical, often common fetishized understanding that when we're talking about productive, we're talking about creation of things physically or provision of services, without considering their economic role. And I just, John particularly mentioned arms production, which I'm wrestling with, because it's a high, the competitive arms trade, arms industry is a very productive of profit industry. And I'm wrestling with fitting that into the categories when, yes, it's all produced for destructive competition between capitals at the level of states, or state, in defense of imperialist relations. Anyway, sorry, I painted the picture. I have a confusion, and I wondered if anybody could clarify it for me.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just want to add and maybe correct what I just said previously. When I talked about that passage in chapter 16, I think it is, where Marx talks about when workers spend their wages on means of subsistence and consume those means of subsistence, that is unproductive consumption. All I mean by that is, all I understand by that is that no new product is created. There is no addition to the total amount of value that is, you could say that, what is the value of the labor power? Value of labor power is simply the value of the consumption goods which workers consume. So there is an equality, therefore, between the value represented in the form of the wage and the value represented in the form of the consumer goods. I mean, this is very, very straightforward. And those consumer goods are then consumed and they reproduce the value of the labor power. So there is no, from that point of view only, it is unproductive consumption, right? That's the only point I'm making. Now, and it is obviously a different matter when the capitalists are also consuming stuff, then they are also not actually producing any new value. And from that point of view, again, it is unproductive consumption. But of course, it's different in so many other ways, as Andy has pointed out, that we could easily get by without the capitalists, but the capitalists couldn't get by without us, at least, and as I agree with everything else that he said there. Now, it is an interesting thing. I haven't thought about arms production for quite a long time, but Capital Volume 2 is, and Capital Volume 2 and July 2024 is a good, what's happening in the world is a very good time to reconsider the issue of arms production. So I'm gonna have to think about this. I mean, I can just start seeing similarities between arms production. You could say, well, arms production to provide, in inverted commas, security, to provide, in inverted commas, a means of enforcing property rights, etc. You could say the same thing about security guards, right? That expenditure on security guards, expenditure on the weapons that you give the security guards, expenditure on security guards, etc., is a classic example of unproductive consumption. Necessary functions, functions which are necessary for capitalism, but actually do not actually generate the production of new use values and new commodities. It is a form of consumption. It takes place within circulation rather than in production. Now, arms production is obviously more complex and involves more than that. And it would take quite a lot of careful examination to work out, to complete the train of thought, which has barely left the station in my comments. So,
well, again, I don't know where to come in quite yet. I mean, basically, there are 2 points here I'd like to make. Right, for me, arms production is capitalist production of arms. It belongs in Department 2B. Okay, it's a particular form of luxury production for the capitalist class. So people are making profit out of it. And when one talks about productive and unproductive labor, productive and unproductive of what? Okay, productive, unproductive of surplus value in the capitalist system is what Marx is talking about. And I mean, I'm sorry to be sort of incy about these distinctions, but he is talking about productive and unproductive of surplus value and not a profit. Because commercial capital, that is in circulation. And we had this long discussion in volume 2 about, the labor of circulation, or the function of circulation is necessary for capital. It has to sell its commodities on the market, but it's not producing new surplus value. It's realizing surplus value. And Marx comes back to this in volume 3, and he says, well, commercial capital is realizing the surplus value that's already been produced by industrial capital. Therefore, the workers for commercial capitalists are a form of, inverted commas, unproductive labor. So all these things are extremely heavily sort of normatively laden, aren't they? I mean, why should those workers be seen as less productive or more productive? Well, surplus value. And the big debate, of course, is about state expenditure. Yeah. In the 60s, in the 70s, I mean, the group I was in, the RCG, they had a big thing about productive and unproductive labor before I joined. And I learned from it, right? And they basically, it's quite an extensive argument, but like, say, nurses working in the NHS, that in general terms is a cost to capital in the health of people like me, old age pensioners and kids, right? It's a drain on the total surplus value produced of society. But if you think about it in terms of reproducing labor power, getting workers back to work, right? I mean, that's actually, exactly in the sense which we're sort of exploring, right? That in terms of the reproduction of labor power, you could think of as certainly in a functional sense is more productive for capital, right? But again, then you have to ask the question of, privatization of the NHS. A lot of these services are now being privatized, and you've got surplus value being produced in the provision of services, right? But I mean, I do think it's possible to take a sort of a class line on this, right? Which is, we don't accept any division based on the production or the realization or the distribution of surplus value for different sections of the working class. These are all forms of distinction of capitalism, right? And in particular, so you've got in NHS, you've got, the NHS in France started, I think in other countries as well, by nurses in factories, right? I mean, they would be there to maintain the workers working, right? And it was a social gain to have a proper system of healthcare, universal, we hope, healthcare, right? So that's unproductive for capital, right? And they will attack it. I mean, it's a social game which is clearly under attack right now in all sorts of ways, through privatization in particular. And that does change the categorization. If it's privatized, then it fits into a slightly different category. The categories that Marx is giving us here are quite abstract, I have to say, right? I mean, if you think of certain concrete examples, like I was thinking of, motor vehicles, right? Well, if it's a van, is it in Department 1 or in Department 2, right? Is it produced to be like a fleet vehicle, and it's means of production? The same vehicle could be used, a Ford Sierra or whatever, can be used as a private car and means of consumption. So they're quite, they even cut across within, particular commodities, let alone industrial sectors. So it's quite an abstraction he's using. And so, that's it.
So while we're still on this, so before I move to Virginia, I've got a quick question. Where does this, because one of the, when I'm reading Capital, obviously he's talking in an idealized form. It's a pure form of capitalist mode of production. But when we're talking about concrete examples, like you were saying then, Andy, obviously I'm thinking a lot about campesino production in Colombia, which isn't this idealized form of capitalist production. So where does the logic apply in these cases where it's not real, where a social formation, you've got a dominant capitalist mode of production, but social relations aren't this pure form of capitalism? Where does the logic apply in these cases?
Yeah, sorry, I just saw also Ginny, but shall I take this and then Virginia? Yeah. Well, the quick answer, it doesn't. I mean, he is this. I would say it's not. Well, these are plays on words. I know nuances, right? It's an assumed abstraction from the capitalist mode of production, right? Now, campesino production itself can take different forms. We know the most developed discussion that Marx has of peasant production is Germany and Ireland, right? And both examples are extremely interesting and helpful. So Ireland, it's the colonial exploitation, and he's talking about poor peasants, Irish poor Catholic poor peasants being exploited by English Protestant landowners, right? So the colonial relation is completely embedded in the class relation there, and there they're being driven off the land and become part of the working class in England, right? So that's one example. And the other example, which I think Engels was and Marx in Germany, is very interesting as well, right? Especially connecting with super exploitation, because he says there, I mean, I think, we quote it. He says there, so, the capitalists are quite happy for the rural workers to keep small plots of land, right? Just enough for them to provide for their own food, which means that the wages can be lower. So these are not independent peasants. They're sort of dependent agricultural workers, right? In terms of Latin America, Roger Zartra has written an awful lot on the independent peasantry. He's probably the key reference. But there are other writers about Colombia and the peasantry. You have to look at how independent they are, how much they have to produce for the market, how much of their product is actually taken off them by the middlemen and so on. So the other big colonial example is Africa. And, people like Samir Amin and others are in about Africa, and the colonial merchants took all the surplus product of the peasants just by driving the price down. So they give them a really low price for their product. And that's the way the indigenous peasants are exploited. And sure, there's lots of other colonial examples of that. So that's the power of merchant capital and the state in a colonial or neo-colonial setting, probably. But so the law of value there is, you've got one half of it, which has got your socially necessary labor time, but you haven't got the half which is Marx is bringing in here all the time, which is the sense of commodities as the products of capital. Insofar as peasants are not yet capitalists, right? That aspect is not coming in. It's very much they're still labor products.
Virginia, and then Walter.
Yeah, thanks. Just apart from the question, I wanted to ask if you could spell out the name of that person you mentioned, Andy, on peasants in Latin America. That would be great. But Roger somebody or other. But also, yeah, slightly frivolous, I suppose. I mean, in relation to John's point about unproductive eating of peas or something. Well, if you compare cows to people, and Marx is writing about cattle and cows, I think, doesn't he say at some point that cows are always productive, or words to that effect, because their manure is used in the cultivation of, land, etc. So isn't it just so far a failure of imagination on the part of capitalists that the eating of peas is not somehow transformed into another means of productive uses? That's all.
We didn't have that much.
Okay, Walter.
Yes, this discussion of productive and unproductive has led me into considerable confusion ever since John brought it up in the discussion. My understanding has been that, for example, arms production is unproductive because the arms do not re-enter any circuit of production. They neither enter as elements of constant capital nor of anything contributing to the reproduction of labor power. On the other hand, I was, while people were talking, I was trying to search through volume 2 to where Marx defines unproductive consumption. And I don't see why workers' wages or the goods that the workers buy are unproductive, since they do enter into the reproduction of workers' labor power. And the same, I would think, applies to, say, nurses or other healthcare workers who are keeping the workforce going. That is, therefore, contributing to the reproduction of labor power. And you might add as well teachers or others who produce a necessary, education, or therefore a contribution to the reproduction of labor power. So I haven't found where Marx says that. I mean, I found where he says it, but I don't understand why workers' wages are unproductive.
Oh, sorry, I'll have to look at the chapter 16. But
I was looking at. Does it go back to chapter 16? I was looking at chapter 20.
Okay, sorry, you mentioned earlier on. I thought that's what you were going back to.
Yeah.
Or John mentioned earlier on. Well, look, there's a distinction. Just be careful in various ways, right? There's a distinction between a claim of unproductive consumption and unproductive labor, right? They're not the same thing.
Right.
Okay. So the test in a capitalist system of productive or unproductive labor is, does it produce surplus value, right?
Right.
And if it doesn't produce surplus value, even if it allows for the realization of profit, in Marxist categories, you'd call that unproductive labor, because that's the labor of circulation, if you like. Okay. So I've already mentioned it's merchants and so on. This is not the same, and this is highly normative, right? From a social point of view, what is productive and unproductive is entirely different. I mean, whether or not they're reproducing labor power, nurses are productive labor for the totality of society, right? I mean, from a social point of view, even though surplus value is embedded in arms, right? And they are, from the point of view of the capitalist system, that's productive labor producing those weapons. I'm fairly clear about that. Okay, right? But it's in category 2B. I mean, the commodities that are produced, they don't circulate back into the reproduction, right? But capitalists employ workers who extract surplus value from them in making those aeroplanes and what have you. But from the social point of view, that's completely unproductive. Welfare, not warfare, is the sort of left social democratic chant, right? The issue which Tim hinted at, which is the debate I come from, is that we're not only opposed to arms on that basis, we're opposed to arms because they're the arms of imperialism. You know what I mean, right? There's a further social opposition base for this. I mean, they're an expression of imperialist power, basically. And even though the workers produce surplus value, when I actually heard this just yesterday, like actually in a Corbyn sort of event, saying the workers in the arms industry aren't to blame for the fact that they're producing arms and they're just ordinary workers. Well, yes and no, in my opinion, to be honest, right? I think yes to some degree, and you have to look at it concretely, but they're productive for the system, but the working class as a whole, they should stop doing it, really. I don't know if that's the social point of view overlaps. Another good example, right? Teachers, right? Teachers from a social point of view, generally speaking, productive. They teach all our kids, right? They're not productive for capital unless they're employed by a private school who the commodity that capitalist is selling. And Mark, this is the point that also Tim noted, right? It's not about tangible and intangible. I mean, the commodity there is a year's worth of lessons, sort of thing, right? So that is a commodity which carries surplus value, the surplus labor of the teachers employed. Okay, so that could be like an ESOL college or something, right? They sell a product, they sell ESOL courses, learning English, right? That is intangible, but it's producing surplus value for the capitalist employing of teachers.
We've got a question in the chat. Could one commodity be consumed in order to produce another commodity? Would this be an example of productive consumption? Right, Penny?
So let me just get this right. Good one. Well, this is interesting. There's it's slightly gone out of fashion, but again, going certainly back to the 70s and 80s, there was a very strong influence of Sraffa and the so-called neo-Ricardian school, right? And in the readings, I just put, it's one of the advanced readings, is by Fred Mosley, and he's writing in that context, right? And there's a sort of a neo-Ricardian interpretation of the departments of production, which is implicit in what I'm saying that I don't agree with, right? Which is that it's all about use value, right? That commodities are used to produce commodities, products are used to produce products. Well, yeah, that misses out quite a lot. And what it misses out, first of all, is the role of active labor in the production of commodities. And second, that commodities aren't just products, they've got exchange values, right? So it misses out money. But you can abstract away from the capitalist nature and just say, well, it's all about inputs and outputs. It's physical inputs and outputs, right? And that's a mistake. But I mean, at a certain level of abstraction, there's a truth to it as well, because you can think of any mode of production in terms of the movement of the use values and the inputs and outputs. It's just that in the capitalist mode of production, you cannot separate use value out from exchange value. And you cannot separate out exchange value from surplus value. So it's I'm not quite sure if that properly answers the question, but it allows me to make a point anyway. Commodities don't produce commodities. The only commodity that produces commodities is labor power.
I think on that note, we'll leave it there. We've gone past 7 minutes past 7:30, but it's been an absolute pleasure as always, Andy, for another tour de force, and I'm sure people will appreciate it on YouTube when we upload it soon. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you everybody for coming. We'll be doing the next talk in about some months' time, so make sure you're signed up to the lecture. And all the rest is it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Sure.
everybody.
Cheers, Andy.